Hi, I'm your host, Peter Sawchuk. I'm a professor of adult education and workplace learning at the University of Toronto. On this episode of Work, Learning, and Social Change, Emerging Voices, we hear from Jamil Kalim, a doctoral researcher studying emotional labor, race, teachers' work, and learning.
Hi there, I'm extremely pleased. You're going to hear all about what we're going to be talking about today in a second, but let me just say right at the beginning here, I'm extremely pleased to bring to our audience out there a special series of discussions on advanced work and learning theory and research. But this discussion series is focused on cutting edge new voices on sometimes persisting issues, things that persist, challenges that persist, but they're new voices that are bringing new ideas to the table, new combinations of ideas. And today I'm speaking with Jamil Kalim. I'm going to give him a proper introduction in a second, but just to finish off this opening thing, I'll say that we're going to hear the specifics of Jamil's research, and the whole principle of this kind of discussion series is, A, it's informal, but also that in the specifics of the research, we're going to hear a specific doctoral thesis project. We're going to hear and learn about overarching lessons about studying work and learning, things that different people can do in different ways. In this case, we're going to focus on the concept of emotional labor. We'll probably mention a little bit of a classic reading by someone named Arlie Hochschild, who we'll learn about a bit. And then all this links to questions of teachers, work, learning, and race, okay? So there's my little introduction, that's my opening blurb. But now I want to give our guest, my friend, the discussant here, a proper introduction. So before I start with my first question, Jamil Kalim is a doctoral student at the Department of Social Justice Education at the University of Toronto. He's about to defend his doctoral thesis. God willing that all the reviews come in properly and in a timely fashion.
We're waiting. Okay.
We're waiting. So he's excited about it. I'm quite excited about it. He's more excited than me, I'm sure, because it's his life. But beyond his graduate studies, it's important to know that he's had a very lengthy and successful career as a high school teacher in the city of Toronto, Canada. This includes time teaching in, and he can correct me in a second on this, time teaching and developing what I think was one of the city of Toronto's early Afrocentric transitional year programs.
Yes.
Okay. Yes,
program?
That's true.
Yes.
Over his career, he's appeared several times on the Canadian Broadcast Corporation programming, addressing various topics, including questions of race we'll talk about today, as well as poverty. And before his time as a teacher, he worked in a whole range of on the ground, on the street, community-based settings with both adults and children and youth. And then finally, I'll say, and you're going to get a sense of this in a second, that he's also has an artistic spirit. He's a musician, he's an artist, he writes and performs poetry. He's worked as both a director and an actor. And I'm dating us both, Jamil and I, to say that I think, and he can correct me on this again, I think we first met back in 2006, maybe earlier than that, possibly.
Probably earlier than that, but yeah.
Maybe. And so that gives everybody a sense of
how long a PhD takes.
Yeah, well, some of that, and then also how long a life can take. In any case, welcome, Jamil. I want to dearly thank you for joining me and doing this sit down with me. And then I'm going to ask you a first question, if that's okay.
Dr. Sawchuk, thank you very much, sir.
No problem. I appreciate double back to you. Okay, so my first formal question, I have it written down here. Jamil, can you tell us about your doctoral thesis? Now, it's entitled An Investigation of Emotional Labor and Race in Teaching. And then more specifically, can you tell us more about yourself and how you kind of came to arrive at the focus of this research?
Yeah, in my own sort of personal history, I've used art as a way of understanding the intersections of race and emotions. And I think that over the years, through painting and writing, also, working in education, I really started to bring together the idea that race has impact and can have negative impact. But I didn't really have a language to sort of discuss that. And I think Arlie Hochschild was very helpful in allowing me to view, or at least explain what I'd been seeing, partially, in my professional life, but also in my personal life, because she has two very important concepts in her text, The Managed Heart, written in 1983. Um, One being emotion work, and the other being emotional labor, which is really the focus of her text. And for me, both of these concepts were freeing and liberating in terms of being able to understand some of the dynamics that I had experienced and I had heard or read about other racialized teachers experiencing as well, um, you know, in the TDSB, but also in the Greater Toronto area.
Yeah, I mean, I want to follow up because you know this well. Other people might not know this. The subtitle for Hochschild's thing is something like the commercialization of emotion. Maybe it's human emotion or human feelings, but it's specifically this kind of economic from this kind of the situation of the economics, relationships and structure of work. In her case, the I guess gendered work. How it began its inner journey to shape the identities, sometimes in extreme ways, between the public self, the private self. And if you could talk just a little bit, I want to go on to another question here, but it relates all nicely to what you said. Um, there are these concepts of the inner and outer self, deep acting, I believe, surface acting,
Yes.
and the idea of how this is part of the emotional labor versus, as you said, emotional work. Can you just speak a little bit about those kind of ideas that Hochschild put up, and then I guess you can cap off. You've already started to say it. How you've kind of taken that in a kind of new terrain around the lives of in terms of race as an economic category in a sense, I think.
Yeah, I think Hochschild, started to develop a language that really goes back, you know, like Rousseau was talking about the noble savage. Hochschild mentions Rousseau's work in her book. This is going right back to the beginnings of what we know as sort of sociology. These concepts that within society people act, is something that we've seen throughout sort of the history of sociology. So, she picks up from Rousseau, she picks up on Freud, she moves these concepts of sort of acting in public spaces, in private spaces, um, into sort of structural areas. So she looks at Lacan and the idea of the other, Hegel, the idea of the other, so she's able to recognize and help us recognize, bring all of this sort of sociology together, and put it, I think, match it really nicely to Marx's idea of use value versus exchange value. And she sort of moves Marx's idea from the sort of physical labor aspect to the emotional labor aspect. So for Hochschild, she's looking quite specifically at airline stewardesses, and the emotional work that they have to put in. It's almost prescribed by the various airlines. So even when dealing with hostile clients, they would be expected to be kind, motherly, sometimes sexual, whatever the sort of client sort of needed, was sort of put onto the airline stewardesses. And although this was a huge part of their job, just like for a waitress, the idea of smiling, even if the client isn't very kind, because that smile is linked to a wage. It's linked to a tip, and that tip could be critical in terms of paying, rent, mortgage, buying food, etc. So, the smile is definitely linked quite intimately. And that smile, in Hochschild's sort of structure, could be either done on a surface level where the person is quite aware of the fact that they are smiling. So, if you're behind a counter working at McDonald's and you ask the person, would you like fries with that? And you put out this automatic smile. That is prescribed. You know that you're doing it. You're very conscious of that, and it's part of the job. It's part of what you do. Now, if you are in a situation, again, say a stewardess, and you pretend that the cabin, this airline cabin, is your living room, and that these people are your guests in your personal living room, and you convince yourself that this is that type of space, the acting becomes much more what some might call authentic or more believable, right? It is more accepted by the client as being authentic. And there is something in that that Hostile considers to be exploitative. And this again is where, you know, understanding of Marx and Marxism is absolutely critical in understanding where Hochschild is going with emotional labor. She does not see exploitation as a positive, right? In the same way that Marx did not see the unequal distribution of wealth as a positive thing, right? This was a reality that needed to be dealt with. For Hochschild, I believe emotional labor is an exploitative enterprise, right? That at times works when transmutation, or, you know, the ability to sort of take what you're feeling and smile, and that all works and everything's good. But there may be times, and this is where I become very interested, where individuals find this oppressive, right? The fact that they actually have to create a smile, although this person just spilt, you know, hot coffee on them, they still have to sort of pretend that everything's okay, and, you know, smile it off, and sort of have all of that negative sort of stuff exist in the tacit domain. For me, this was a very interesting space, especially when linked together with race, right? Because quite often when race occurs at work, where it becomes conscious, where it rises to a certain level, it's quite often negative, right? When race sort of disappears and is a non-threat, you know, things are relatively normal. But my research was actually looking at incidents where race occurred at work, right? So if you had an experience at work and it intersected with race, I wanted to learn about that. I wanted you to report something on that. And that really showed this idea that there was racialized emotional labor. There was something sort of specific about, racialized bodies' experiences in the workspaces, that they actually had to do this extra labor in order to sort of maintain what Hochschild also describes as the feeling rules in the space, right? These rules that we all grew up with. You know, as I sort of describe my poem and I'm going through the streets, it's the feeling rules. It's what my mother taught me. It's what my teachers taught me. It's what, you know, the church taught me. It's what all of these different sort of elements taught me about how to respond in a public space when you feel completely humiliated, right? So my response was really based on the feeling rules that had already been sort of inculcated into me.
Well, okay, but here I just want to draw this out even more because, and this is unique to the world of work, and this is where it kisses with Hochschild too. This is because you mentioned racialized emotional labor, so that's a key concept for you, and that's I think original concept. I mean, it leverages Hochschild, but it takes it in a new direction. Now, the economic, because Hochschild is the commercialization of human, so there's this economic hyper exploitation on this hidden level, if I'm understanding the term racialized emotional labor. It's
Yes.
extra work, very hidden, that a racialized teacher has to perform in order to keep the organization. Is this what you're saying about schooling? And it's, I guess what you just said, the feeling rules of a working, a functioning school?
Yes.
I'm following correctly?
Yes. So institutional emotional management is another one of the concepts that Hochschild brings about, and that I found absolutely profound. Right, that the institution itself is invested in managing your daily emotional output in the service industries, right, and teaching according to Hochschild, is considered one of the sort of service industries. And really our product becomes the curriculum, right? Like we're supposed to sort of deliver this thing, and the thing that we deliver is the curriculum. But the reality is the mode by which we deliver it is a prescribed mode, right? And it starts at the very top of the organization. This is a very sort of hierarchical space where you have sort of teacher, vice principal, superintendent, all the way up to director. So in this structure, there are also sort of emotional structures that are implied and are sort of held in place through things like ostracization, sort of sanctioning, so there are all of these subtle ways in which at work, if you do not respond in an emotionally appropriate way, you can be sort of sanctioned. And this can and often does impact on people's ability to advance within teaching. So if you are oppositional to authority emotionally, this means it would be very difficult to become a principal because you need a mentor. And the way in which you get a mentor is by developing healthy emotional relationships with colleagues and administrators. So if you're having trouble in your communication with your colleagues, that will impact on how you communicate with the administration, which will impact on whether or not you ever become a principal, head of department, et cetera, et cetera. So your emotional stance, right, that way in which you sort of view how you're going to engage negative emotional situations or micro emotional aggressions that may sort of have racial components to them, really comes down to what we discovered in this research was three sort of main types. And of course, these weren't fixed types, but you sort of had type 1 that was very sort of emotionally involved.
Oh, sorry to interrupt, but I just want to be clear. So these are different types of emotional laboring.
Yes.
Or I should say, in keeping with your term, these are different kind of modes of racialized emotional laboring, and it has to be learned, presumably. And you're saying you found variations. I guess you're going to tell us more about this. I apologize for interrupting, but the idea that there's kind of variations in how people strategize and learn to undertake this form of exploitative or racialized emotional labor, things so necessary for the functioning of a school in its given normalized form, racialized, patriarchal, many other issues. So, and then you found this variation, not, I guess, types. Well, anyway, so back to where I interrupted you there. There's these different types of kind of learning to emotionally labor in a racialized organizational environment.
Yes. So I came up with three types, and I have two examples here. And the first example is what I consider a type 1, and they are, what I loosely sort of phrase as the resistors, right? So there is a system with its own feeling rules. It demands adherence to emotional management, institutional emotional management. And there are some that I sort of classified as type 1s that consciously sort of and subconsciously resist this system. So instead of sort of allowing for the feeling rules to exist and maintaining them, and those feeling rules in this space I refer to as sort of white emotional privilege, because ultimately it allowed white teachers to not have to deal with issues of racism or to have to sort of, do the emotion work when race was an issue. So for example, Black students graduate at about 60%. That means 40% aren't graduating from Toronto high schools. For many Black teachers, this is an automatic frustration. This is an emotional sort of issue that when they go to work, they are concerned about, these racialized bodies. They often are signaled out to sort of do extra work with certain students and that may give them some sense of feeling good, but it also, sort of reinforces the fact that the system has failed. And this is a part of the emotional baggage that they bring with them to work. Whereas for many white teachers, they do not have that same emotional connection to this outcome. And that again shows, the sort of different pressures that a white teacher or a Black teacher may experience in the same building, dealing with the exact same product, being the curriculum. So I have here two examples. One is from Paul, who is a teacher in the middle school section. And he says, quote, "So we have to bottle these things up, keep the stress down from those things that cause stress on us mentally, spiritually, emotionally, physically. And we have to bear it until we meet up with one who has gone through the same thing. Even amongst us as teachers, what if we had our separate union? White people wouldn't allow it." So here, this is an example of Paul feeling that he has to sort of bottle up this stress, which is, as he describes, mental, spiritual, emotional, and physical. And he does not feel that he has spaces or individuals or colleagues that he can necessarily go to sort of help him through, these sort of trying emotional situations. And, again, that is an example of a type 1 teacher who, in their own mind, sort of sees this system as, in a sense, oppositional to their own beliefs, right? Their own sort of way of going about things. Paul believed in a sort of Afrocentric approach to teaching. He tried to bring in these cultural sort of ideas and norms, and he found a lot of resistance. And this for him was something to fight against. And he would often fight against it directly. And this led him to a lot of conflicts with colleagues as well as administration, which, again, for type 1s, it seemed to be sort of the way that the process went, that you would have a situation, you would engage it in a sort of direct way, an almost authentic way, with very little filters. So here is an example where there's not a whole lot of deep acting at all, right? The person's not trying to change any sort of thoughts that they have internally. They're actually accepting their own personal thoughts and saying, my thoughts are fine. These people need to change. Their system needs to change. And that's how they approach it.
So is this where the idea of emotional work versus emotional labor come in? The idea that this, you call it type 1, and Paul, I assume it's a pseudonym.
Yes.
So if I'm understanding your conceptual framework correctly, Paul is doing an enormous amount of emotional work, but since it's not being internalized, vis-a-vis those examples from Hochschild, those airline stewardess who would learn a new identity in keeping with the feeling world. So Paul is not doing that. He's not engaging in much emotional labor. Am I following?
That's right. Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So when I say that he's not doing a whole lot of acting, really acting in, so his quote unquote authenticity really negates his emotional work, with his emotional labor within the workspace. So he is doing emotion work, right? He is doing, the work of trying to control himself and trying to do this and trying to do that, but it's not being done for the benefit necessarily of the institution, right? He is almost sort of anti the institution, especially when it comes to emotional management, right? So if they try to emotionally manage him, he sort of goes against that. And that, in a sense, is a negation of emotional labor, right? So he does sort of negate and sort of skirt around doing emotional labor. And that can lead to problems, right? Because that leads to conflict. Emotional labor has a positive element, which is to sort of grease the palms of relationships. It allows for the smooth transition of ideas and kindnesses when it functions properly. When it breaks down, it becomes very stressful, especially for the individual, right? The institution isn't necessarily going to change, but the individual will feel the stress of hitting their head against a wall that is not changing, right? Immutable in a sense. So, Paul really described having a hard time dealing with certain fears of engagement at work. So the various fears that I looked at in education were students, teachers, administration, parents, and even curriculum to some extent. And Paul's engagement with students was fabulous. There, he was his authentic self. He was doing emotion work. He was doing it for himself. He was doing it for the. But when he left that space, he negated to do a lot of the work necessary for that smooth transition that also allows you, for example, influence within the space, to advance within the space. So people tended to shut down around him because of his direct engagement, especially with anything to do with race.
Just a follow-up question on that. I would probably, we're going to run out of time to talk about the other two things. So you might just maybe define them for us. But before we get off this kind of example of this one style of emotional labor and emotional work, the distinction between those things, the learning of these new strategies. It's the case that when you mentioned the idea of emotional labor as making, greasing the wheels of a smooth, am I correct to say greasing the wheels, emotional labor, greasing the wheels of a smooth racial economic ordering of the workplace? Is that roughly, I mean, I'm popping a lot of words together there, but
Yes.
so the emotional labor makes those wheels just churn all nice and smooth in keeping with the racial economic order.
Yes.
I
Yeah.
see. Okay.
It's in keeping with it. It maintains, white emotional privilege. So if one engages emotional labor and doesn't sort of fight against it, then they are maintaining the institutional emotional management styles and techniques of those particular institutions, but they're also maintaining, just a larger societal, sort of white privilege. But here, it's specific to work and it's specific to emotions. And again, it is the negation of having to deal with anything racial in any deep way, that but that allows white teachers a certain privilege, and that privilege, that sort of element of relief, in critical race theory, they would say that allows for psychological and economic, social advancement, right? Because instead of worrying about this particular situation dealing with race or that particular situation, you can just talk to teachers about curriculum. You could work on, getting your online courses together, right? You can sit down and strategize about that instead of wanting to deconstruct why this teacher came to school in blackface, which just happened this Halloween, where a teacher was recently fired for coming to work supposedly in blackface. So these are issues that Black teachers, I believe, because of our sort of historical trauma, can trigger sort of negative emotions, which could keep you away from, first of all, positive feelings, which obviously at work is very good. It connects you to work. It connects you to your colleagues. It connects you, to the people that you're serving. And if you don't have those sort of racial issues that you have to deal with, you can also now focus on advancement. So you can think about becoming a vice principal or becoming a principal in a space that you're comfortable in, as opposed to becoming a principal in a space that you think is inherently racist and does harm to racialized students and employees. It's a different sort of mind frame if you're on board.
But yeah, granted, yeah, I know exactly what you're speaking to here. But what I find fascinating is that it's, if you just boiled it down to like having almost more work, having more work tasks
Yes.
as a racialized teacher. If it was a to-do list, is metaphorically imagining your to-do list as a non-racialized teacher, as a white teacher, as I'll just say 3 things to do: get my class ready, blah blah blah. The racialized teacher has get my class ready, da da da, those 3 things. Plus, okay, now figure out a way to either engage in racialized emotional work or racialized emotional labor, and that task set, I mean, I'm sorry if I'm oversimplifying, is absent from, this is what your research is telling us, right?
Yes.
Okay, Bill, now I want you, just as a teaser, because we're going to run out of time, give us what is the names of you mentioned the 3 kind of styles or types. You mentioned I think called the resistor as an example, and then what are the names of the other 2? Just as a teaser, people will want to go back to the thesis to read about them. It's a little like almost like a trailer for a movie,
Yeah, we have the resistors. Type 2s are the accommodators, and we have type 3s who are stick to the work, right? Stick to the job. So we have stick to the job, right? Head down, do your work. We have the accommodators who are the equivocators. In this case, they use a decision tree sort of technique in order to determine whether or not they're going to engage this situation of a microaggression head on and try to make change with it, or just allow for this to slip and slide and sort of deal with it at some other time, a more appropriate time. The accommodators tend to also be the ones that are very interested in making systemic change within the institution, as well as they see advancement as being critical. So for them, positive emotional engagements, even in the face of microaggressions, becomes a very practical thing economically and socially within the institutional space. The stick with it, stick to the classroom, type 3s, they tend to not see race as much of an issue at all, and to really see that as a distraction, and to focus more on issues around curriculum and students and sort of school engagement activities. So they again are very focused on school and work, and do not necessarily think that race is or should be a part of your sort of emotional day. So for them, race wasn't necessarily critical. For type 1s, race was everything. Race was just about everything. They saw themselves as coming to make a change, to bring social justice, to bring an understanding, to bring the other from the margins into the center, and quite often they became, let's say, more emotionally connected to the idea of being a Black teacher and really emphasizing Black, um, than they were sort of connected to the idea of, transmuting emotions so that this system could continue to function. Like that was, they're not overly concerned. Whereas type twos were very conscious of the fact that there was a game to play. Yeah, you got to play it. Sometimes it hurts, but suck it up, do the job. Yeah.
Oh, well, I mean, okay, let me cut to the chase. I want to conclude my last question, which is just briefly, what's next for Jamil Kalim? But before I do, I have to ask this question. Now, who are the type 1, type 2, type 3? Your analysis produced these different kind of styles. It's demonstrated there's different styles of engaging in this combination, some varying combination of racialized emotional work, racialized emotional labor. Who, just give us one final teaser, who, type 1, type 2, type 3, who does the most racialized emotional labor according to your analysis?
Yeah, it would be that's actually a really good question. Type one does the least. That is easy. That I can sort of take out. They are sort of, Rousseau's noble savage, right? Their emotions are right there and raw. Type twos are the sort of equivocators, right? They sort of remind me of the gate man in Macbeth. The guy that's opening the gate and he's talking about this sort of equivocation of a lawyer at the gates of hell. So they sort of remind me of sort of lawyers that are constantly using this sort of decision tree, looking to see, whether this is profitable, profit, loss, gain, probability. Like they're looking at all of that, and they're very sort of strategic in that sense. So I think they definitely put in a lot. But I think the people that do it the easiest would be the type threes, because they're absolutely not aware. Well, not necessarily not aware, but they are not bothered by this idea of race. They're not bothered by white emotional privilege. They don't recognize racialized emotional labor as being a part of their work. That would suggest, according to Hochschild's theory, that they've really internalized deeply the ideas of institutional emotional management, and that they are actually practicing deep acting at the deepest level, because again, type twos at times swing between surface and deep acting, and are quite often conscious, right? Which means that they do a lot of surface acting, right? That they are doing this strategically, whereas the type threes sticking to the class, they tend not to consciously engage REL, which means that white emotional privilege is taken for granted, that their existence in the space is fine, which means they've done a lot of homework. They've done a lot of the work in order to transmute these feelings, just like the airline stewardess turning the airline cabin into her living room. These guys have turned the school into an incredibly safe space like their living room, and they don't see harm, coming racially, which means they've already done the work, right? That they've already built in that their responses are quite authentic.
So that is to say then that they do probably effortlessly, but they do a great amount of racialized emotional labor. These kind of keep your head down, and they contribute a great deal to the racial economic order of the schooling institution.
Probably more than anybody, right? If the question was who contributes the most, I would say it is them, right? Who contributes the most to white emotional privilege? Type threes, sticking to the class. They contribute the most to maintaining the order. The type twos are trying to move towards change. So although they maintain order, they're doing it on a surface level because they're doing it strategically. Type ones are sort of the noble savages that are very sort of authentic and aren't transmuting and aren't really engaging emotional labor successfully or, or at all. So yeah, the type twos, I think less deep acting, more sort of surface conscious acting. Type threes, very, very deep, to the point where they effortlessly, as you said correctly, maintain white emotional privilege. And it is, yeah, it is effortless, it is seamless, which means they're doing a lot of that work um, subconsciously. Transmutation is happening successfully. If they see microaggressions, they just pass it by. It doesn't really affect them. This is like, you know, in a sense, this is emotional labor, perfect. 2.0. This is how it works, or how the institution would perhaps like it to work. And of course, these aren't fixed categories. Individuals will ebb and flow between. Probably a type 3 will never be a type 1, but a type 1 could become a type 2, and a type 2 could become either a 3 or a 1. That's my belief.
Right.
Or from sort of what I've seen in the research, type 1s don't move much. Everybody else has got a little bit of flex, and I do have 2.1s and
Right. Yeah,
3.2s.
these kind of categories, like that old kind of, I guess, a methodological tool, which is the ideal type. That it doesn't actually describe the actual person, but these are kind of types that people move in and out in between. It's more of an analytic category. But okay, this is very provocative stuff. It's exciting stuff. That just the notion that people are learning in these hidden ways that can take wildly different directions in their lives around these incredibly important forces, economic, racial forces in teachers' work. It's fascinating. Okay, well, we're running late on this, but I have to ask, what's next for you? You're going to finish this, defend this doctoral thesis shortly, and then what kind of plans do you have next? Any other work, learning, research coming up, or what do you want to do?
Well, I am thinking about doing some work, with emotion work, and I've been thinking a lot about that emotion work, moving from slavery, and sort of focusing on emotion work, and then how it jumps into, say, something like the Pullman Porters, post slavery, where we sort of move now into labor, and you still have a lot of that sort of slave culture, and now it's being applied to work. So there's a space in there that I wish I had sort of linked a lot more closely together. Also, I also wanted to look a little more at race and education in Canada, slavery, race, education. So, I'm sort of really, now that Hochschild's allowed me to sort of see, how, these critical theories can really magnify something that you've been looking at, and, give you a language. Because if you just look at it, it's overwhelming. It's like, wow. But now that you have certain tools to sort of, take it apart, it's something that I think I will continue with. So I like where I'm going with WEP, REL, REW, racialized emotional labor, racialized emotion work, white emotional privilege. These are all spaces that I think I would like to sort of continue with and further develop, not necessarily in teachers' work, but just sort of further develop and link a lot closer to the enslaved experience, and how that still sort of impacts and echoes, those historical traumas, how they still impact emotionally today. So yeah.
Okay, so that is another big to-do list. A lot of cool ideas there. I really hope that you don't go completely abandon us in studies of workplace learning and social change and go off in some scholarly direction that we never see again. But I have a feeling you won't, because it's a great contribution. And I'm so happy you took some time to spend a little part of your afternoon. And I know you got lots to do, so I really appreciate it. And it was a pleasure
Appreciate it, sir.
Pleasure speaking with you. And we'll talk soon. I want to remember to say this at the end of each of these kind of discussions is if work is forthcoming, certainly when you graduate, we want to maybe attach this video discussion with a link, a live link to your doctoral thesis.
That'd be great.
Okay.
I'd love that.
Well,
absolutely.
Good. It's been a pleasure talking with you again, and great just seeing you. And we'll be in touch.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate it.
Okay. Take good care.
You too.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.